Hey everyone, welcome to this edition of Free Thinking, where we explore stories, people, and ideas shaping our world today. I'm your host, Montel Williams, and today we have a very, very special guest talking about leadership. It's something that we talk about here a lot on this show because, quite frankly, everything rises and falls on leadership. Whether it's in government, business, or even in your personal lives, the principles and practices of leadership have power to make or break families, organizations, and even entire nations. But we're not doing it alone. Today, joining us is the author of a new book, What Hangs in the Balance, a powerful critique of leadership today through the lens of ethics, competence, and integrity. He's a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel, an intelligence officer, and a military attache for over 24 years on active duty, someone who's seen leadership in action and in failure from some of the most heated and high-stakes environments imaginable. Please welcome Lieutenant Colonel Philip Johnson. Thank you so much, sir, for being a part of the show today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Montel. Pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. It's really weird. I've made the statement and said it multiple times. I think one of the biggest problems in our country right now today is though we have people that call themselves leaders, we have very few that understand what leadership really is. But before we dive into talking about your book, I want to back up a little bit and talk about yourself. Let's tell me a little bit about your background. You were a decorated military career. Just give me about where you're from. Give us a little background.
Sure. Yeah, I was a military brat, an Army brat. My father was an Army JAG officer, so I grew up mostly in France, Germany, and then eventually Florida and a few other places. Decided at a fairly young age that I wanted to be an Air Force pilot and pursued that. Went through 4 years of ROTC at the University of Florida and then was commissioned. And then did intelligence work as intelligence officer for about 3 years before finally going to pilot training. So I spent most of my career flying helicopters and planes, and then, as you mentioned, did some attaché work at the U.S. Embassy in Manila for 4 years, and then a bunch of staff jobs before finally retiring 8 years ago.
And you transitioned flight, out of flying into becoming an intelligence officer. Did you ever get assigned to the National Security Agency?
No, I didn't.
Okay.
No.
Yeah, I was there for quite a bit. But is that right?
I
You were pilot first, then
Actually, I was an intelligence officer first because of the budget cuts in the early 90s. They had me do something else initially for 3 years while I was waiting to go to pilot training, and then eventually I went to pilot training. But the attaché work came much later in my career, and that's essentially attaché work as well. That
sure.
was for DIA, but no, I never worked at NSA. Although I noticed we had some similarities in our careers. We were both
Absolutely.
stationed in the Pacific, uh, Philippines, Japan for me, Guam for you, and you were in Intel, of course.
Right. I was a Crippy, so I ended up being at Guam for about a year and a half, and then I was literally stationed at the National Security Agency and Naval Security Group Activity, Fort Meade, for about 8 years, doing direct support cryptology out of there in various places around the world.
All right.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about your book, What Hangs in the Balance. It tackles crucial questions surrounding leadership in both the public and the private sectors using the Trump administration, let's say, as a core case study. Why don't we just start with the broad look? What led you to even write this book?
Yeah, well, first, let me say, I think we have a fine tradition of leadership in the United States, particularly in the military and civil service, and that pertains to leadership training as well. So, after 24 years of serving as an Air Force officer on active duty, having worked with terrific officers and non commissioned officers, and having worked for phenomenal senior leaders, generals, and ambassador, it was clear to me that Donald Trump's leadership was an aberration in both style and substance, and something, frankly, we just can't allow to be normalized. So that realization, early on in the administration, his first term, and probably before he was elected, is what started all this. More specifically, I woke up New Year's Day 2019 and decided I was going to start reading all of Trump's presidential tweets going back to Inauguration Day 2017. And as Kellyanne Conway once stated, Trump needs to tweet like we need to eat. He's prolific on social media and still was. So 25,000 tweets later, I had dozens of leadership competencies and traits I wanted to address in the context of his first term.
I mean, but and forgive me if I say it this way, but in some ways, it almost sounds like an outlier in the fact that he was elected once based on whatever people believed his leadership capabilities were going to be, and now he's elected again. And I listened to a speech today that I was just kind of blown away with the audacity of the lie and the audacity of the misrepresentation of fact. All of which seems to have completely gone over the heads of most people in this country who supported him. Again, he got elected with the majority number of votes, 7 million more than. No, let's also get it straight that Harris did receive 70 million votes. So it's not like she was blown out of the water. There were 70 million votes that went her way. But I would question that. I would think that on both sides, there are people who had some very serious reservations about both their leadership abilities. You outline 40 core competencies that are critical for good leadership in your book. What do you think some of those top core qualities for leaders absolutely they must have?
Yeah, I think four of those include one, patriotism. And in the book, I write about patriotism in the context of what I consider fundamental responsibilities of public leaders. So I would say patriotism. I would say then competence in the context of understanding your role and understanding your organization. And then third, a willingness and an ability to seek counsel and expertise for good decision making.
Well,
And then
all
finally, fourth, oh, go ahead. Yeah.
no, no, go ahead. And
Yeah,
fourth,
and then fourth, character. And by character, I mean humility, empathy, respect for dignity, honesty, discipline, and self control. So I think those four things are key to me.
and I'm not. Again, I will tread lightly here because I know I'm going to get beaten over the head by thousands of people for saying that none of those four qualities does our current president elect seem to have, or honor, or respect. And yet, you say that in the wrong circle and you'll be castigated and thrown out and called some sort of a traitor. I mean, since when did we equate leadership to and the ability to be a leader to a person, an individual, and give them credit for being a leader just based on who they are? You understand what I'm saying? It's like,
Yeah.
yeah,
At some point, it may have become, a popularity contest, I think, and that's one of the things I write about is that leadership is not a popularity contest. Obviously, for elected office, it's a popularity contest to some extent, but leadership itself is not a popularity contest. It's about principle and duty. And I think a lot of people, maybe because they haven't served in government or they haven't served in leadership positions in the private sector, are just somewhat detached from what leadership really entails, and that's one of the goals of my book. I want people both in the public sector and private sector to understand what competent, principled, ethical, and selfless leadership looks like, and the difference it makes in people's lives and subordinates, customers, constituents.
well, but when you look at the current president elect, I mean, those four principles that you outlined at the top as being some of the most important principles for, leadership competence. I question whether or not any one of those principles is something that this current future president holds, and because he doesn't, it seems to have changed the entire idea of what competence of leadership is. And back a couple seconds ago, we mentioned the word patriotism, but I mean, patriotism isn't loyalty to an individual; it's loyalty to a construct, a loyalty to the fundamentals. I mean, you look at things like the fundamental of the Constitution, which he seems to think is just something that can be malleable and molded it in ways that only he wants it, whether or not anybody else wants it or not. And I just don't quite understand why the majority of leaders in this country, other leaders in this country, I use that term lightly, don't get that. I mean, it's like you look at what's happened in the last couple of weeks. People have just gotten in line to, as quickly as they can, run down to Mar-a-Lago to kiss a ring of a tyrant that really doesn't give a damn whether or not they kiss it or not.
And that's a recurring theme in the book is this notion of unprincipled loyalty. If you're a selfless leader, it's principle and duty that are at the forefront of decision making, not self interest. And that I would argue that's my biggest criticism with Trump. Both, lack of selflessness is a recurring theme throughout the book. But at the same time, service before self is something I emphasize, and there are plenty of people uh, who exemplify that in the book as well. People who are principled and ethical. But yeah, this unprincipled loyalty, which is largely self-serving, as you pointed out, is a problem.
And I hate to think that it's going to be way too late for people to recognize what they've gotten into. But I think if you had listened to the speech that I listened to recently, it's very, very clear that the number of times people were. Let's throw out one of the things that was discussed was the fact that, well, we built the Panama Canal, so therefore we're going to take it back. Um, that's not leadership to me. First off, what people are failed to understand is that the Panamanian people also participated in the moving of dirt and actually were, though we did fly in many unskilled and or skilled laborers to work on that project, it was also worked on by indigenous people who lived in Panama. And so for us to think that, or for anybody to think, well, because we helped in its building, therefore we now own it and therefore we can just take it back. I mean, I don't understand how conceptually somebody thinks I'm just going to step in, or I'm just going to make Canada the 51st state.
Yeah,
Um, really?
Greenland.
And I'm just going to buy Greenland whether you like it or you want to sell it to me or not. You're going to give it to me. It's like that's not leadership. That's I don't know, what do you want to call it? What do you call it?
Yeah, so you make an excellent point there. So when you have leaders who lack humility and respect for dignity, that's going to transfer into public policy, the kind of stuff you're
And
talking about.
it's also transferred into public psyche. But go ahead.
Yeah. No, no, go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, it was because when we take a look around the nation and we look at other people and look at some crimes and things that are being committed these days, you wonder whether or not, as the principles that he puts forth, he claims he's the only one capable of understanding, but then there are others who jump on that coattail and think, well, I have the same understanding of those principles, so therefore I can do what I choose to do on my own. I mean, that's not what this country was founded on by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, and we've seen that recently, attacks on truth, science, and expertise.
Yeah, and
Uh,
when you say true science, I mean that's the one that really blows me out the door is the fact that we only support the science that we think supports us. Nobody questions when you hit that switch on the wall, the up and down electricity does flow, but they're even questioning electricity flow.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, in your book, I mean, you do break down complex leadership processes into actionable advice. Tell us a little bit about the importance of trust and accountability in leadership and leadership structure. And again, we had over 70 million people trust and feel that this person was accountable enough to elect as president of the United States. That blows my mind.
No, I think it's a combination of disinformation that has led people to not be concerned with whether Trump is held accountable or not for his actions. It's probably a combination of that, and obviously there are people who understand what he's done but just don't care, and that's probably the more troubling aspect uh, of what's happening in that regard. Um, Yeah, we've seen a lack of accountability for his actions, starting with arguably what was documented as 9 or 10 instances of obstruction of justice in the Mueller report regarding the two investigations they were conducting: one, Russian interference in the election, and two, Trump's own obstruction into those investigations. There was no accountability in the two impeachment hearings, or trials rather, and pretty weak excuses for why he was acquitted in the second trial regarding his efforts to overturn the election. And then, of course, there's probably going to be no accountability for in courts for his efforts to overturn the election as well. But trust and accountability are so important in organizations. If you don't have equitable accountability, you're not going to have trust in leadership. Morale is going to suffer, and that's going to affect mission accomplishment.
And I understand that, well, I don't understand why he hasn't been held accountable for lots of his foibles, but it seems as if we're living in a time when people don't even understand the definition of leadership, and they just voted for, a cult of personality, thinking that they were going to get something. And I think in about another 6 months, they're going to be shocked that they didn't get any voice on.
Yeah, that's what I would hope for. That at some point there's a course correction. And I'm less focused on policy, although I'm probably not going to agree with most of Trump's policies. But that doesn't mean he didn't do some things correctly, properly in his first term, policy wise. But yeah, people need to understand that this cannot be the new normal with respect to leadership. And although I have faith that our institutions like the military and civil service are still training people the way I experienced it in my 24-year career. But that doesn't mean that at some level people might not still normalize what they're seeing. And
Well, when you say you're confident that we're going to continue to train people the way we have in the past, I have questioned whether or not we are going to have the ability to do that, because there's a new generation coming into the senior leadership roles that represent that group of people who, I mean, in the last 10 years, I would say that, we've seen more issues in people philosophically understanding that there is a structure of rank, there is a structure of duty, there is a, and more apt. I mean, I've been told by, and I've not actually witnessed it myself, but I've been told by some people who are relatively senior ranking individuals from 08 and above who have literally looked me in the face and said, it blows my mind who we're dealing with sometimes in the junior ranks, or not only enlisted ranks but officer ranks, because they have people look them back in the face and say, well, why do I have to do that? It's like, well, excuse me, when did that ever become something that you thought you had the ability to say when it comes to a direct order? you know so I wonder whether or not what we believe, you, I, and some other
yeah,
20 plus year military personnel think was appropriate. Now it's not appropriate. I mean, I think, are we going to see, yes, I believe that we've had the greatest fighting force this planet has ever seen. We've had it. I'm not necessarily sure if we still have it. Until we're tested under fire, I'm not sure we know what we have.
yeah. I mean, to some extent, the professional ethos in the military, in terms of what we find acceptable, has changed obviously over the years as society changes. But I'm reminded recently of how the standards for people entering the military have been relaxed somewhat to meet recruiting goals with
Correct.
respect to physical fitness, potentially criminal background, etc. Uh, and so it makes me wonder: is there going to be a relaxing of ethical and other standards? Um,
It can't. I mean, from my perspective, it can't but be a relaxing of some of those other standards. I mean, if you change. you change the baseline and lower the baseline. You can't expect that lower baseline that's now entered to automatically jump up here back to the baseline that you had set years ago. I mean, and I'm not. This is not an aspersion on anyone who steps. First off, anybody in our society who steps up, puts their hand in the air, says, "I do solemnly swear and affirm to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic." I think don't need a pass, but you've got to respect them. However, those people who are putting their hand up in the air, some of them are the same people who actually invaded the Capitol
Right.
4 years ago. Some of them, and there was I don't know, depending on who you listen to, that crowd outside of the Capitol a year ago, 4 years ago, was made up of between 5 and 10% former and active duty military personnel. That makes me question what happens if you have to send that same group active duty, and not all of them were arrested, not all of them were thrown in jail. Some of them were, still stayed outside and they were on the fence line, but they participated. Now, if I ask that person to take that hill, is he going to look me back and say, here's a finger to you, boss? Screw you. I mean, I don't understand how we can trust those individuals to put nation first when they obviously clearly put selves first when they did what they did.
Yeah, and that's the responsibility of leaders, especially senior leaders, to uphold standards. I mean, people come into the military, for example, since you mentioned the military, with beliefs that may not entirely gel with the values and principles of service or the organization they're joining. Nonetheless, they still have to conform to certain standards, and ensuring that happens is a leadership responsibility. But as you pointed out, for the last 8 years or so now, we've seen a very different and troubling example from the very top. So you may have senior leaders in the military saying one thing to their troops. At the same time, these people are going to see a different example from the commander in chief.
Right. Right. Yeah. Their feet are taken out from underneath them. I mean, I also look at, a couple of weeks back where an active duty Green Beret literally blew up a truck in Las Vegas, and another former service member, opened fire and claimed he wanted to join ISIS. I mean, it's like I'm thrown a little bit, and I don't think anybody really paid attention to the fact that there was two of these guys. Right now, this is where I go back 30 years, and I will venture to say that I don't think we ever saw that. I don't think we ever saw an active duty member actually, commit such heinous crimes. Yet that's happening today. And, I mean, how much is current leadership looking deep into the souls of those who are wearing uniforms? I mean, it's seems crazy. And with I know we can't ban social media from military personnel, or we could do it, but if we did so, I know that this would be a violation. Would happen, one in every three troops would violate that requirement and go ahead and use social media anyway. But you think that social media poses some extremely some really rough pitfalls for today's leaders, right?
Absolutely. I mean, disinformation. Uh, yeah, I spent a decent amount of time talking about that in the book, but disinformation is leading to, especially because of the internet, is leading to radicalization, and that's just going to lead to more violence. Unfortunately, disinformation and propaganda. Um, you know, in some cases, in the case, I guess, of one of those service members you were talking about, and the recent attacks, he had mental health issues, but in other cases, people are just radicalized, online often. So,
Which blows my mind, especially in this day and age where, I mean, we would think that there would, because of the concerns of what we've seen happen now around the world, by aligning yourself with some of these radical organizations, that more Americans would be turning against it. But some way, shape, or form, these radical organizations are penetrating into the soul of, into what would be the spine of what is our military. And I don't know if we are even ready to address how to address that. I mean, I think by the 3 years from now, when they finally say, well, let's put together a commission, it's going to be 3 years from now, and we've already let that cat out of the bag.
Yeah, in fact, I remember there being some criticism in the media about, and perhaps from people in the military as well, about a focus by the FBI on military members returning from places like Afghanistan because they were seeing an uptick in radicalization among service members. So, as you point out, I think that's something DoD and military leadership need to take very seriously. Um, but even though
Yeah,
we're not talking about a lot of people, but it's happening nonetheless.
well, we see what one can do, and one can almost take down an entire hotel. That's if I think if he had the right materials, that Trump International would be sitting there right now. And then he chose to actually demonstrate his angst against Donald Trump, and I don't think there was any mistake in him picking a Elon Musk vehicle to do it in.
Yeah, the strange thing
So
is he was apparently a supporter, according to his family. I think he was apparently a supporter of Trump. So that's the strange thing. But again, he was experiencing mental health issues, and yeah, but an even bigger threat, and right now I think we need to be concerned about. According to the FBI, between 2015 and 2020, the biggest terrorism threat in the U.S. was from racial and ethnic extremists. So
right. Now, your book uses Donald Trump's presidency as a case study in failed leadership. That's pretty much a bold choice, but what lessons can our current leaders, both the government and private sector, draw from his examples?
oh well, first of all, I think in my experience in my own career, the examples of what not to do tend to stay with you much longer. If you're used to working for good leaders, it's just becomes normal and you don't think about it too much, but you remember those examples of what not to do. So as you point out, there are a lot of examples of what not to do in the book across a wide range of leadership topics. At the same time, I complement that with examples of people who were acting ethically and responsibly, and often those people were working directly for Trump, and they were
Mm-hmm.
pushing back on things he wanted to do, or they were, convincing him that what was in the national interest was in his best interest. So yeah, there are plenty of examples. Again, it is certainly a book with lots of examples of what not to do, mostly courtesy of Trump. But I complement that with what principled, ethical, competent, and selfless leadership should look like.
Let's say that he hired you tomorrow and said, I read your book and you're an asshole, and I wish you never existed. However, I bet you could help me get across the finish line. What would you try to do? What would be the first thing that you would do and advise him to do to kind of straighten out his act? I mean, that's another way to put it. But I mean, what would you advise him to do? I mean, first, would you even take the job? But what if tomorrow he called you up and said, I read that book. You just raked me over the coals. So if you're so smart, what do you want me to do? What would you tell him?"
Well, I think the first step for any leader is to understand and acknowledge your mistakes. You can't improve if you don't acknowledge your mistakes. You can't do better if you say your response to COVID in the early months was a 10 out of 10, or if you're continuing to lie about the 2020 election, and numerous other things, of course, and spreading disinformation. Um, but it's about understanding your own faults and being able to communicate that to subordinates in a normal leadership environment. But
I mean, I think one of the most important traits that a leader has is surrounding themselves with people who can fill in the gaps for their lack of knowledge or their not competency, but I mean, to be able to Surround yourself with those people who have the abilities that you can call upon and trust that what they're going to say, okay, that might be a good decision. Then let me bring that aboard. He doesn't seem to have that in his psyche. It's like, anybody who he said it 100 times. I'm smarter than all the generals. I'm smarter than all of the scientists. I'm the smartest person on the planet. Well, wow. It's like, geez,
Yeah,
have,
but you shouldn't have to surround yourself with people who have character because you don't. You shouldn't
right.
because you shouldn't be in a leadership position if you don't have the basic qualities of character that I mentioned. But yeah, to your point. So with his issues of being open to counsel and expertise, because he believed himself to be an expert on any number of issues, to know more than anyone on quite a few issues. Yeah, so you're not going to, he exemplifies some of the barriers to receiving and evaluating and accepting advice, which are self-interest, arrogance, the inability to suppress personal bias. Some of his most senior subordinates have talked about that, and I quote them in my book, talking exactly about that dynamic with Trump. And also, when you start to contradict your experts, that's not going to help you get good advice either.
Yet we still see that 77 million people voted for him to lead this nation, which tells me that 77 people don't even understand what leadership is, or they're confused some way and thinking that his support for their hate is they should give him support for that. And I'm blown away. I literally spent some time over the holidays, with some relatives and friends, and I was really just blown away how they can compartmentalize his um, inadequacies and think, oh well, that's no big deal. It's this that I really support, and then I start to realize what they support is just another initiative of hate. So as long as he hates the same thing they hate, they will vote for him. You know what I mean? I'm kind of blown away with that. And I mean, what? How did our society? How did our psyche as a nation fall to this level? I have a couple ideas myself. I think that you know the shock effect of the Obama election literally destroyed some individuals at their core, thinking that they thought they would never, ever, ever in their lifetime see that happen, and oh shit, that happened, and so we got to make sure that never happens again. Oh Lord, I mean, those who were so shocked at this election cycle, I laughed at because 4 years ago I said this guy was going to be elected again. I took money, and not that I'm proud of it, but I made financial bets 4 years ago that he would be reelected because I knew that we have a group of people, we have a segment of society who will never, ever, ever get over the fact that Obama sat in the White House. It was like, oh Lord, that's an oxymoron. But he did, and they were going to make sure that that would never happen again. And when it came to, Vice President Harris, for anybody in this society, in this, patriarchal society, to believe that we are going to have a female president of the United States in the next 20 to 30 years, they're crazy because there's a whole generation's got to die off before any acceptance of anybody different will happen again.
Yeah, when Trump made a speech somewhere in Florida saying that there's no way that Kamala is going to be our first socialist president or whatever, especially a female president, something like that. I'm paraphrasing it. Apparently that
Mm-hmm.
didn't bother a lot of people, as you point
Right.
out. And I wish I had had your pessimism about the likelihood that Trump was going to get reelected. I honestly, when I was working on the book, finishing up the first drafts in 2021, I did not imagine that. I might have worked harder to get it published before the election if I had thought that was going to happen. Not that one book's going to make that much of a difference, but yeah,
Oh, it could.
it
Well,
could.
it could have.
And and to your point, you talk about voters. So in that sense, maybe it's not just people in public service and in private sector organizations and leadership or management positions that need to read this book. People need to understand how government's supposed to work, how leadership and government's supposed to work, and that's going to help them maybe make better choices when it comes to political candidates.
But in order to do that, we got to go back to some really basic fundamentals. We have to start teaching what leadership is in schools. I mean, leadership isn't who screams the loudest. It's who, comes up with ideas that support the majority rather than support the minority. And we don't even teach that in schools these days. I mean, part of that is even teaching effective communication. I mean, what role do you think communication plays in successful leadership? And how can some leaders improve their communication skills? Because I see so many of these people who want to try to express their ideas, but they fall flat in communicating that to the masses.
Yeah, yeah, that's a tough one.
It's a tough one, right? I mean, because we don't even teach communication in school right now. I mean, communication in school is in between what the teacher's saying. Some kid sitting, the 12th grader sitting in the third row, still banging away on the internet. And, when now colleges have to deal with the fact that, majority of students there, they have to actually look at every single paper turned in to make sure that it wasn't created by some sort of a bot rather than the person who handed the paper in. And, leadership isn't about, it's about knowing how to use those tools, but not relying on those tools to represent you.
Yeah, on the other hand, now there seems to be an emphasis, or people tend to cling to persuasiveness instead of the substance of what somebody's saying. And so that,
Mhm.
you could be a great communicator in that sense and be persuasive, but what you're spouting is BS and potentially harmful to your organization or the country at large. Um, yeah, I don't remember any communication classes in my education.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, there was a time in this country where humility was something that was applauded, and most of the time had pretty significant impact on your team or your organization. When you had a leader who clearly demonstrated humility, and I'm not talking about self deprivation, but I'm talking about, or not deprivation, but where persons put themselves down in front of their organization, but a person who like recognizes that it's not all about them. That actually bolsters a team and organization's efforts. Now we're at a time where we've got a leader who says it has nothing to do with the team. It's me. It's me. It's me. It's me. It's me. It's me. And when you hear that, it's almost as if those who work for that individual feel as if their job and their responsibilities are insignificant and aren't even necessary.
And a lot of them don't seem to care because they want that proximity to power, they want that influence. So it's
Yeah.
and with what we're seeing now, this notion of unprincipled loyalty, that's just being amped up here in the second term because Trump's choosing loyalists over everybody else. So what's going to suffer there is competence when you're focusing on loyalty. And then of course you have folks that are going to be afraid to speak up because they're afraid of being branded as disloyal. But yeah, humility is so important in leadership for so many reasons.
And I am not as dire as I think, or as you think. I'm not you think, but as I sound. Um, but I think this is putting America in a crossroads. There was a period of time in the last couple of years. I've said it several times. I believe that America has seen its better days. I don't believe we even know what's about to come down the pike. I mean, if some of these initiatives that the current president elect is talking about, openly, if some of these initiatives are put forth, it's going to put us in a really dire position with the rest of the world. I believe. I mean, you make an attempt at, I don't know, annexing all of Canada. You know, do we really think our northern border is going to be that safe? And do we even think our northern border is that safe right now? Which it blows me away. I mean, he points to the southern border because he can point to a demographic that is easily defined by the color of their skin, but doesn't point to the northern border, the eastern border, or the western border when it comes to demographics that you think are, I mean, I don't want to use any individual nation's names or culture or race of people, but I mean, there are some Eastern Bloc Europeans who will come into this country who may look one way, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they agree with anything that the majority in this country who look that way agree with.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know people who in the military who have come from former communist countries, and you would expect them to have a certain view about the importance of a liberal democracy, and yet you find some of these people supporting somebody like Trump. It's
Right.
confusing. Um,
It is confusing. It's confusing because at the end of the day, and I am, believe me, I'm not a motion picture conspiracy theorist or, but I mean, you know, we've now been discussing that sleeper idea for over 50 years, 60 years. And I will, as much as, you know, mankind seems to gravitate to fiction of years before, I think some of those individuals that we've let in from some of those Eastern Bloc countries could be actual dedicated sleepers who were just wanted to make sure they got into that position to then begin to wreak the havoc that they could wreak.
yeah, and at the same time, we have a president and an electorate backing him who is attacking the FBI when they're doing a lot of the
FBI,
important work to
CIA,
prevent that.
yep, yep, FBI, CIA, and I just it blows my mind. I mean, have like yourself having worked in intelligence, I think most people in this country don't even understand what that really means. There are years put into observing and watching and looking and analyzing and then to just step in and say, oh, that's a bunch of garbage. You don't need to do that. These people are okay with me just because they gave them a gift on a state visit doesn't necessarily mean that these are people who support any of the ideas that we hold or we used to hold as the basis for our democracy. I mean, what are some of the key qualities that you believe every exceptional leader should possess?
Key qualities. Again, I would focus on if it's public service, I would focus on patriotism, competence with respect to understanding your role in your organization, um, the ability to make good decisions, and that requires being willing to seek counsel and expertise. And again, character. You have to have character, humility, empathy, honesty, respect for dignity, discipline, and self control. And all of those things were lacking, as I point out.
But when we look at some of the some of the leaders that have been elected officials in this country who have gained support of some of their own constituents. And now we look at those people being castigated the way this president is castigating, like the entire, January 6th committee, some of our staunchest American supporters are now being looked at as if they're some sort of traitor because they've now don't agree with the one individual rather than they have supported, the ideals that make us what we are under this flag. That scares me. I will tell you because I think, if we end up in a position where you can only be a leader if you agree with one person, I think, again, like I said, I think America will have seen its better days.
No, and that's why, yeah, we need to survive the next 4 years in that regard, and hopefully, kind of boomerang back to an earlier time. Yeah, people like the people that are being persecuted, the people you mentioned, for example, like or that you hint at, like Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, those folks who are now being targeted by Trump. Those are the people who are exhibiting principled leadership and selfless leadership. I mean, they both knew they were going to lose their careers essentially by choosing to serve on the January 6th committee in Congress, but they did so anyway, um, because they weren't, self-interest was not the guiding principle for them. Um, so that's the big thing, and maybe that's what you're talking about. Society at large, there's a shift to, what's in it for me. I mean, I think that's always been around, but maybe more so now because of how what the example people are seeing.
Yeah, which scares me for tomorrow. I mean, I don't I use this term every now and then. Some of my friends hate it when I say it, but I'm in my last quarter. I mean, I've been around here for a while. 68 years old, and blessed. I mean, if the luckiest I could be is, let's say I live to be 100. Those last 10 years are going to be, eating porridge in the morning in my breakfast table. But I fear for what's going to happen for my grandson, who was just born a couple of years ago. I mean, I don't think this America that we even see today is going to be the same America 10 years from now, based on the next 4 years, because we could literally go through a period of time over the next 4 years that actually starts more wars than we've been sitting on the sidelines from to date. I mean, right now I was listening to a speech, and there are 45, almost 50 plus armed conflicts going on around the world right this second. And, one side seems to think that, well, as soon as I get in office, all those things are going to stop. They're not going to stop. They didn't stop when we got in the first time. They're not stopping the second time. Yet there are people who buy into this.
Yeah, and now we have a rise in authoritarianism around the world, and authoritarian regimes actually cooperating to work against Western democracies. Um, so going back to your point a few minutes ago, it's hard to know, the damage that was done in the first 4 years, the first term of the Trump administration. How much of that we've actually seen already, and as you say, who knows what the effects are going to be after another 4 years. And that's why people who care about democracy and the standards that we've been accustomed to in this country, need to continue to fight for it.
Not, and I'm not trying to be the doomsday guy, but put your crystal ball on. I mean, what do you think the next? I mean, if he comes out swinging on January 20th, trying to arrest, trying to prosecute, trying to go after anybody who's a naysayer. I mean, and he's got I don't know what you want to call him, a minion or a troll who, just because of the fact of the amount of money he has, thinks that should be the ruler of the world, hooked to his hip. I mean, we could be in for a very troubled time over the next year.
We could, because things have changed somewhat. I mean, there were people that try to keep him, within certain boundaries during his first term, and frankly, our institutions held, the rule of law held. But things are a little different now, in part because you have all these people whose actions are going to be guided primarily by their loyalty to Trump. So they're not going to be trying to rein him in. At the same time, we've already seen judges, in Florida in the classified documents case and at the Supreme Court making decisions that are a little baffling in terms of, his immunity, for example, as long as it's allegedly official conduct as official authorities as president. So I think some of the guardrails that we had in the first term have been relaxed. So I'd like to think that the rule of law is going to hold, as you said, if he tries to, lock people up and prosecute people for simply dissenting, for being critics, for being principled. Um, but we're going to have to wait and see. I'd like to think that judges and juries are still going to do their part, take their oath seriously.
We would hope. We would hope. Philip, I got to tell you, your book, What Hangs in the Balance, is a clarion call for leaders across all industries to step up to the plate and hold themselves to higher standards. If you could leave our listeners with one final leadership takeaway, what would it be?
Well, I'd talk about just for a second the title itself, what hangs in the balance, what that means. And I have to give a shout out to my editorial director at Forefront Books, Kia Harris, for plucking that phrase out of the preface of my book and suggesting it as a title. But essentially, what hangs in the balance is another way of saying what's at risk. What's at risk when we don't have principled, ethical competence and selfless leadership. And so it's things, in theory, it can be everything. But let's get more specific. At the organizational level, it's things like morale, retention, the ability to recruit, and ultimately mission accomplishment. At a more macro level, it's quality of life and even life itself on occasion, trust in democratic institutions, good governance, and as we were discussing a minute ago, even the rule of law. So, I would just stress that, principled, ethical, competent, selfless leadership is that important. It makes that much of a difference in the lives of subordinates and the people that are served by either companies or government organizations. And we can't allow what we've seen recently to be normalized.
So important, so important. Your message needs. Where can people get your book, sir? Make sure people again know. Where can they go to get it if they wanted to? What hangs in the balance?
Yeah, so anywhere that books are sold, essentially. More information about the book can be found on my website, philipjohnson.com. And the book's available anywhere essentially to order online or.
Well, sir, I'm not just saying it and letting it roll off my lips as a lip service statement. Thank you so much for your service. One act of duty.
And for yours.
Thank you so much for your service now, sir.
Yeah.
Your words are needed, and I hope that people run out and find and get a copy of the book, What Hangs in the Balance, wherever books are sold. And I would love to have you back at another time if you ever want to talk about just chop it up a little bit more in leadership here and maybe give us some more examples of what we can do to change or make some change. We'll do that the next time we chat. Thank you, sir, for being a part of the show today. I wish you and your family much well, and I hope that people will actually order the book, read it, and understand our future hangs in the balance.
Thank you so much, Montel. Appreciate it very much.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And thank all of you out there for supporting Free Thinking with Montel. And until next time, keep seeking the truth, asking questions, and as always, stay free and stay free thinking. See you on the next one. Thanks for joining me on Free Thinking with Montel. Please make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell to be notified when new episodes post each week. We'd love to hear feedback, so please send us your comments. Military Makeover is so grateful for the support of Purple Heart Homes, a nonprofit organization that rebuilds and transforms the homes for our veterans.
Our heroes come home with sacrifices most of us can't imagine. As a veteran myself, I've been there and founded Purple Heart Homes to help.
When I tell the story of Purple Heart Homes, it's the freedom to not have to depend on somebody else to do the simple everyday things in life.
Visit phhusa.org/makeover to learn how you can help.